Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good evening to everyone, and welcome, salam to and welcome to Saleh as well, all the way from Mozambique in Africa. Tonight we are going to have a presentation by Saleh on the issue on the topic of apartheid in Palestine, as presented by the Amnesty International report. Now, we are very aware of the injustice that is ongoing in Palestine, which have started even before World War II and have been going on until today. And the international community are not very serious in tackling this. They have been talking about two-state solutions for decades now, while Palestinian lands are being stolen and being confiscated and by the Israelis, and also people are being Palestinians are being killed and houses are being demolished, thousands of them. And it's time for the world to wake up and see that this talk about the two-state solution is just a tactic, a delaying tactic to allow Israel to seize more land and to demolish more homes and commit more injustice to the Palestinians. So what we need to recognize now is that it's more serious than what is happening now. It's very serious. People are being killed, and the crimes against humanity in the form of apartheid is going on in Palestine at the moment. And there have been reports on this, official reports by United Nations itself, as well as by Human Rights Watch, and the latest is actually by Amnesty International. And in this regard, we are very lucky tonight to have a person who was very involved in the preparation of the report itself, Mr. Saleh Hijazi, who was actually the former Deputy Regional Director for MENA, Amnesty International, and also now the African campaigner at the National Committee of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, BDS. He's also a member of the steering committee of the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, a member of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and he has a background in liberal arts from Lawrence University in the United States, a master's in human rights from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, and a graduate diploma in social studies from the University of Bahia in Brazil. So Saleh, the floor is yours. You have 45 minutes to explain the issue to the audience. Go ahead, Saleh.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Professor Nazari. Really very thankful for the opportunity to engage with an audience in Malaysia, a country that is very close and dear to us Palestinians, and also extremely important in our struggle and in the global struggle that we fight together for justice, freedom, and equality. So thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I was worked for Amnesty for almost 11 years. 5 of those were spent working on the report under the title Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and a Crime Against Humanity. And we'll come later in the talk to explain this title because it really captures the way that Amnesty has tackled apartheid, Israeli apartheid in Palestine and against Palestinians. But I think it's very important to begin by saying that Palestinians have been theorizing and conceptualizing about Zionist settler colonialism and regime of apartheid that it has imposed following in Nakba. Nakba is the word Palestinians use to describe the massacres and the ethnic cleansing that took place around the time 1947 to 1949, around the time of the establishment of the Zionist state, Israel. And once the state was established, finding that there were still Palestinians who were not expelled. They did not leave. They remained there. There was a system that imposed that would always privilege then the Israeli who became Israeli Jews, the Zionists over the indigenous Palestinian population. One of the main theorists, Palestinian theorist of Zionist apartheid was Faiz al-Sayegh, who headed a research center that was part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and was also a diplomat. He wrote about Zionist colonialism, and within which he saw that Zionist apartheid was part and parcel of apartheid that was taking place elsewhere in the world, particularly in Southern Africa. That it was not a mirror of it, it was not a copy of it, but that it was an integral part of what was happening in this post-colonial era, whereby in some of the colonies, particularly, for example, in South Africa and in then what became in colonized Palestine, that you have colonizers who remained with, of course, the indigenous population, and you needed a new way of governance that would always privilege the colonizers over those who are colonized. And of course, the answer was apartheid. And there are many, there are books and many who have looked and studied the deep relationship that there was between the Zionist state and the apartheid regimes that existed in South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, that was at the time, Rhodesia, and others. So very important to set this out, that Palestinians have been theorizing and conceptualizing Zionist apartheid for a very, very long time, since the beginning, basically, of colonization of Palestine around the time. And then, let me take you from the 1960s, when Faiz al-Sayegh wrote that book, Zionist Colonialism, to the year 2001, because I think this is the year that really marks the beginning of the moment in which we are living. And this moment where understanding of Zionist rule in Palestine and what is happening to Palestinians as apartheid, that we see now being mainstream, I think, and many of my colleagues as well think that this sees its beginning in 2001. What happened in 2001 was that the UN organized the first conference on anti-racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, and other, which was held in Durban in South Africa. And the Durban Conference, what became known as the Durban Conference, was a conference of both states and also civil society. There were thousands of civil society organizations that have participated in that conference, including Palestinian civil society, human rights organizations. And towards the conclusion of that conference, the Palestinian civil society organizations have made a call at the time to end Israel's brand of apartheid, here, quote. You know, they used that terminology, brand of apartheid. And that declaration then was endorsed and supported by then the thousands of other civil society organizations from all around the world who were participating in the Durban Conference. Why we see that as kind of the beginning of the moment that we live in there, because that is the time when the framing of apartheid, as it is defined under international law, has found its place in the discourse and in the work of civil society organizations. Now, the time is very particular because at the time, Palestinians were undergoing or revolting in what became to be called the Second Intifada. The first Intifada was in the late 80s towards the early 90s, when Palestinians revolted against Zionist rule, and in 2001 was then the Second Intifada. And that is also around the time that Israel then began with strengthening and making more violent and more fierce the system of segregation and control, including by building what Palestinians came to be called the apartheid wall. This is literally a wall that was built to segregate between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, including in the settlements, the illegal settlements that are found in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also to separate Palestinian communities from each other and grab more land, colonize practically more land that would come under the control of the state. So following the call in 2001, we see then Palestinian civil society mobilizing and starting to use the framing of apartheid as defined under international law in their campaigning, advocacy, and mobilizing work. So in 2002, a large coalition of Palestinian organizations launched the Stop the Wall campaign, which is a campaign to then stop that wall that Israel was building that I just described right now. In their founding manifesto, or in the declaration, in the call, Stop the Wall Coalition or Stop the Wall campaign has used the framing of apartheid. In 2004, there was the launch of the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel campaign. It's a campaign that calls for then the academic and cultural boycott, you could say from this name, in order to pressure Israel until it respects the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people and respects international law. In 2005, there was the BDS call, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And again, the call for the international community, for solidarity organizations, from people around the world to boycott Israel, divest from it, and impose sanctions against it until it complies with international law. And both the calls of PACB and BDS have made central in their call then apartheid. The call of both academic cultural boycott and the boycott, divestment, and sanction was to carry out the boycott activities until Israel ends its military occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism. In 2007, there was the formation of then the National Committee of the BDS, the BNC. This is where I work, and this is the largest coalition in Palestinian society. And this is where, at the time, we see then the framing and the discourse of apartheid, again, as found in international law, being globalized, because then solidarity groups from all around the world, including, for example, Malaysia, North America, Europe, Africa, have responded to this call, and therefore have, in their own actions and their own adoption of BDS, have also started then using BDS until the end of military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. But it is really, and some people may also see that as telling of the unfortunate double standard and hypocrisy of the global North, the powerful West, that it was only until the last couple of years when Israeli and international human rights organizations came to identify what is happening in Palestine as apartheid, that we see then this framing and this analysis and this understanding of the situation being mainstreamed and has come then to the attention and being used by then media, many politicians around the world, and so on. So what we have now is, despite this criticism, which I think is very valid, that unfortunately sometimes it takes organizations from the global North to take on what Palestinians have been saying for many years, for it to be acceptable and legitimate. But when doing so, they have provided us with a brilliant, amazing opportunity. So we have now an opportunity, a situation where a number of organizations, including Israeli organizations, that have come to say that system of control and rule by Israel over Palestinians amount to the crime against humanity of apartheid as it is identified under international law. Now, to say there are differences between these reports. So there is the two Israeli organizations who have come out first, one called Yashdin and B'Tselem. There is Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International from the international organization side. There's also reports by UN mechanisms, particularly the Special Rapporteur on the situation of rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, Michael Link, and now the new rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who are using the framework and analysis of apartheid in describing then the situation on the ground. Let me now, not to go, and of course I'll be more than happy in the question and answer to go into the differences between the reports if anyone is interested. But let me go into the Amnesty report right now in a bit of detail, and of course I'll be happy to answer more questions about it as well. But before going into what the report says, let me tell you the story about it, because I think it's very important, and I've been involved in it right from the beginning. As I said, I worked for Amnesty for almost more than 11 years. The majority of these years were spent developing this report, and the story goes that Amnesty is a global human rights movement. It's made up of what is called national sections that are members of this movement who make the decisions on policy, and they carry out the campaigns in the local context, but also on solidarity and support of human rights struggles elsewhere in the world. And there were requests by some sections, in particularly sections from Spain, Greece, and other places, asking what is called the International Secretariat, where research and policy is set in Amnesty International. They asked the question about whether the crime of apartheid, as it is defined under international law, and I'll come to the definition of apartheid in a bit, under international law, applies to the situation in Palestine. At the same time, I was a researcher at the time, and we had produced a report that looked at a pattern of unlawful killings by Israeli forces against Palestinians that was published in early 2014. It was called Trigger Happy. And it looks at how Israel uses excessive force, including lethal force, in what would amount to a war crime in a situation of occupation against Palestinians. We put out the report, and in the report there was a case study about the village of Nabi Saleh. This village was carrying out weekly protests against the Israeli occupation and settlements, and trying to reclaim a water spring that illegal Israeli settlers have taken from it. And these protests were met always with massive violent force that have led to the injury of many and the killing of a number, but also use collective punishment, including, for example, the puncturing of water tanks and the closure of the village and whatsoever. So to punish the villagers for then protesting and claiming their rights. And then the village of Nabi Saleh and the story was part of this report, because it was just a very clear case of then the violations that the report was exposing. And I went with my colleagues from Amnesty after the publication of the report to meet with the community, give them the report, and discuss what we can do now that the report is out. And you remember, Amnesty is a campaigning organization, and it works very closely then with the communities, including victims of human rights violations. And of course, the community of Nabi Saleh were very welcoming. We came in, there was in a big room with many of the activists and people from the village, and they were very happy to receive Amnesty. And then one of the prominent activists from the village stood up, and he was holding the report, and he opened the report to the recommendations page. And every Amnesty report has basically the law, the documentation, the evidence, and at the end there is the recommendations of what states, what authorities, what international organizations should do. And he opens the page of the recommendations, and he says, again, thank you very much for this report. It's very important, the documentation. But what I see here is that Amnesty is telling Israel how to kill better. What he was saying there was that what Amnesty was doing is trying to reform a system rather than tackle the rooted systematic oppression that Palestinians were living. That a report is important, of course, in terms of the evidence and the documentation, but that when it came to what should happen, it was cosmetic. It was basically not tackling the root causes, but telling Israel that they should have better open fire regulations, that they should have better, for example, accountability measures when children are killed, but didn't come to this, the real question that Palestinians are concerned with, which is why is there an occupation to begin with, and what should be done about it, right? So the root causes of this. And of course, they pointed out to apartheid. Now, this was, and I must say, this is something that I was very proud of, and still am, of Amnesty, that it does listen to the people when there are criticisms. That point was taken back. It was taken back seriously, and we started deliberations. Now, unfortunately, a few months after the publication of the report, that was in February 2014, Israel launched its massive military offensive on the Gaza Strip in July of 2014, in the war that lasted 52 and wrought massive death and destruction on the besieged and occupied people in Gaza. Now, at the time, Palestine, that has in 2012 become observer state at the United Nations, was able to join the Rome Statute, basically was able to join the International Criminal Court, allowing the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over the occupied Palestinian territories, so the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And the state of Palestine has asked for that jurisdiction start from June of 2014 onwards. So now we are in a situation where, speaking as Amnesty, we have this criticism that was coming from the community of Nabi Saleh and others in the occupied Bank about giving cosmetic recommendations to systematic and infrastructural oppression. We have Amnesty International sections asking about the crime of apartheid. And also now you have a jurisdiction over the International Criminal Court over the occupied Palestinian territories. And the International Criminal Court has, as part of the Rome Statute, of course, crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, including the crime of apartheid. So we started looking at whether the crime of apartheid applies, and recognize that Amnesty requires a policy on apartheid, basically a policy that would set out how Amnesty defines apartheid, of course, referencing international law, and how it go about examining a situation and whether it amounts to then apartheid or not. And so a policy was set. In 2017, it was made alive and it was then implemented. And it was from then 2017 until 2022, the 1st of February, where that policy was implemented and then the research was done. Let me say a little bit about the research itself, because I also think that is very important before also we're going into then the law and the report. So in looking at whether, when you're looking, anybody is looking at something. Hello? Yeah, Professor Nazari, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Just now you went, the frame became frozen. But it's okay, I can continue, please.
Okay. So saying when looking at systematic violations of deeply rooted patterns of violation, we need to look at them over a long period of time. So what we've done at Amnesty was look at the documentation that Amnesty International has carried out of human rights violations in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, basically in colonized Palestine, from the beginning. When the first time, and I found as a researcher, I found the first documentation was from the early 60s. It was a report about unlawful detention, administrative detention at that time, and torture of Palestinian activists. And the documentation becomes more systematic with time until the first intifada of the late 80s, where the organization Amnesty, as well as others, Human Rights Watch and the and some of the UN bodies, starting more systematic documentation of human rights violations by Israel against Palestinians, or human rights violations generally carried out in Palestine. And so we looked at all of this. We looked at the archive of Amnesty International in terms of human rights violations. We also looked at Israeli archives of laws that were passed and the discussions of laws around them. We looked both at laws, policies, and practices, but not only in a certain moment, over a long period of time. So it was very extensive research, and it was actually, the report is one of the largest and most extensive reports that the organization has ever produced. We usually joke actually with academics to say that we broke the record of footnotes in this report, teasing other teams in terms of kind of the referencing of it. So let me, before going into kind of what the report details, say how apartheid is defined under international law. Apartheid is a violation of public international law, a grave violation of internationally protected human rights, and a crime against humanity under international criminal law. 3 main international treaties prohibit and/or explicitly criminalize apartheid: the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICERD for short; the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, or the Apartheid Convention; and third, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The crime against humanity of apartheid under the Apartheid Convention, the Rome Statute, and customary international law is committed when any inhuman or inhumane act, essentially a serious human rights violation, is perpetrated in a context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another, with the intention of maintaining that system. A regime of oppression by one racial group over another with the intention to maintain that system. So a regime of oppression and domination can best be understood as the systematic, prolonged, and cruel discriminatory treatment by one racial group of members of another with the intention to control the second group. Thus, the crime against humanity of apartheid is committed when serious human rights violations are committed in the context and with the specific intent of maintaining a regime of systematic, of prolonged and cruel discriminatory control by one group over another. And here, of course, you have Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. The framework of apartheid allows a comprehensive understanding, grounded in international law, of a situation of segregation, oppression, and domination by one group over another. So Amnesty International notes and clarifies that the system of oppression and domination will never be identical. Therefore, it does not seek in this report to argue that or assess whether any system of oppression and domination is perpetrated in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories is, for instance, the same or analogous to the system of segregation, oppression, and domination as perpetrated in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. So I think this is a very important point, because a lot of the reaction and responses then when the word apartheid is mentioned in describing the situation in Palestine is, you say, but it's very different from South Africa. It's very different from where the concept and the understanding of apartheid came from. And the answer here is very simple, that apartheid, yes, as a word and as understanding came out from South Africa, but it was codified in international law. It became a crime under international law. And it can express itself, this crime can find itself expressed in different ways in different contexts. So for Amnesty to determine whether Israel has created and maintained an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination, the organization looked at the way Israel exerts control over Palestinian people. It also considered a number of serious human rights violations that would constitute the crime against humanity of apartheid if committed with the intention to maintain such a system of oppression and domination. So, what does now, explaining the law, how apartheid is defined under international law in the 3 instruments I just explained, we come to the report, Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity. And if you remember at the beginning, I wanted to say something about the title, which is that, if you notice, Amnesty has put apartheid as two things here in the title. One, as a cruel system of domination, and two, as a crime against humanity, because it's the two things at once. It is that system which amounts to a grave violation of human rights. So it does an analysis of apartheid under international human rights law. And it's also a crime against humanity. And therefore, the organization also does analyze apartheid under international criminal law. So what does Amnesty conclude in the report, in the 230-page report? It says that since its establishment in 1948, Israel has pursued a policy of establishing and maintaining a Jewish demographic hegemony and maximizing its control over land to benefit Jewish Israelis while restricting the rights of Palestinians and preventing Palestinian refugees who were, of course, forcibly expelled from their homes in 1948 and 1967 from returning to their homes. In 1967, Israel extended this policy to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which it has occupied ever since. So, and I think this is very important, that what Amnesty has found, that the system of oppression and domination, which we have described under international law, was basically with the establishment of the state in 1948. And it was created so that it privileges only one group, here the Jewish Israelis, over then the other group, the indigenous Palestinians. And a crucial part of that system is then the Palestinian refugees who are prevented from returning to their homes after they were forcibly expelled. And why so? It's because if they are allowed to return, that hegemony and control in both demographic and geographic sense would not hold. And so it was also very crucial that Israel prevents Palestinians from their right to return. Now, another very crucial component, and what sets this report different from others, is that Amnesty sees the system created in 1948 and extended then to these territories and the Palestinians who've come under the control of the Zionist state after 1967. So it doesn't start with the occupation that we know now, that is more than 55 years. It starts actually with the establishment of the state. So what the organization has done is it analyzed Israel's intent to create and maintain a system of oppression and domination over Palestinians. And with that, we mean the intent is how intent is expressed in law, policy, and practice. And how we were able to analyze intent is, of course, by analyzing the law, policy, and documenting the practice of human rights violations. But we've also looked particularly at some of the, or at the discriminatory racist laws that Israel has passed since its establishment. And not only the laws itself, we've also looked at the discussions within the Zionist parliament, the Israeli parliament, around the passing of this law. So we looked at the statements that were made by parliamentarians justifying and explaining why laws of, for example, only allowing Jews to return to the land but preventing Palestinians from returning, what the justification was made in the discussions in passing of these laws. So Amnesty has analyzed Israel's intent to maintain the system and examined its key components. One, the territorial fragmentation of Palestinians. Two, the segregation and control. Three, the dispossession of land and property. And four, the denial of economic and social rights. So fragmentation, segregation, control, dispossession, and deprivation. These four make, if you want, the pillar of this system of domination. By fragmentation, we mean how Israel purposefully and within intent keeps Palestinians separated into different territorial areas. As we see now, you have the occupied West Bank, you have the occupied East Jerusalem, Gaza. Three of them are separate from each other. You have Palestinians who are second-class citizens of Israel, also separated from them, the three. And fifth, you have the Palestinian refugees who are denied the rights, and those in forced exile denied the right of return. So the fragmentation, which is at the core of Israel's apartheid. Segregation and control is then the separation of Palestinians from Israeli Jews, but also the separation of Israelis from Palestinians from each other. I, for example, live in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. I'm never able to, for example, visit Gaza, and sometimes there are villages around me that I'm not able to reach or use the roads of because of this system of segregation and control. And control here also includes military rule. And Israel has always used the strategy of military occupation and rule since the beginning. It imposed military rule over Palestinians who remained in what then became Israel following the Nakba. Until 1967, when then that military rule was imposed on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and which is still the system of control until now. Dispossession of land and property is how this is basically the colonization, annexation. It's where right from the beginning how Israel used law to take property away from Palestinians, starting with those who it expelled outside during the Nakba. It passed laws that would allow their properties, lands, homes, shops, and others to come under its control. And then, of course, put the majority of the land, 97% of the land in Israel is in control of Zionist institutions. And the denial of, or the deprivation, the denial of economic and social rights, this is the fourth pillar, if you want, is then always keeping Palestinians at a disadvantage when it comes to economy and the social rights they can enjoy as compared to then Jewish Israelis. Amnesty in the report concludes that this system amounts to apartheid. So again, this is a system of apartheid. It has also, in the report, shown documentation of unlawful acts committed by Israel against Palestinians with the intent to maintain this system. And these include forcible transfers, administrative detention and torture, unlawful killings, and the denial of basic rights and freedoms or persecution. So again, going back to the title, because I think it helps. You have the cruel system of domination, and this system is made of four pillars: fragmentation, segregation and control, dispossession, and deprivation. And then you have the crime against humanity. And here you also have four pillars: forcible transfers, arbitrary detention and torture, unlawful killings, and persecution or the denial of political and civil rights. And by just to explain, forcible transfers is a legal term that describes acts such as, for example, home demolitions, deportations, and others whereby people are forcibly removed from the place they live or reside to another place, including by, for example, taking away their homes. So Amnesty concludes that such acts, these acts that I've described, the unlawful killings, forcible transfers, administrative detention and torture, unlawful killings, that such acts form part of a systematic as well as a widespread attack directed against the Palestinian population and amount to the crime against humanity of apartheid. So again, here how the organization has seen where the start of the system is and how it's both a system of domination and oppression and also a crime against humanity. Now, in very short, there are 7 pages of recommendations in the report. These recommendations are to the State of Israel, they are to third state parties, other governments, to the UN. But in short, the organization Amnesty calls for Israel to dismantle this cruel system and calls on the international community to pressure it to do so. It also says that all those with jurisdiction over the crimes committed to maintain the system should take action against them. So let me stop here. I've given an overview of the apartheid framework and analysis, how Palestinians started using it from where, and then how Palestinian civil society particularly started using that analysis to the moment we are in now with major international human rights organizations, including the UN. And now we have states as well, Malaysia being one, South Africa and others who have addressed Israel's apartheid in international fora. A very, very specific, special, I think a very important moment. Going to the Amnesty report in its details, the apartheid, how it's defined on international law. Of course, the story about the report, apartheid, how it's defined in international law, and then what the report says through documentation and analysis about apartheid in Palestine and against Palestinians. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Saleh, for a very detailed explanation of the contents of the Amnesty International report on apartheid crimes in Palestine. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get some to help enlighten the topic more. Number one, the first one is when we hear Israeli officials trying to deny the injustice against Palestinians, and they always highlight the fact that Palestinians in historic Palestine, what is Israel now, are given opportunities to become to progress in their careers. They can become judges, they become politicians, they become professionals, and they say that there is a proof that Palestinians are not being discriminated against. Now, how do we counter that kind of argument? That's my first question, and maybe you can elaborate on that first. Thank you.
Sure. An excellent question that indeed is used to by Israel and by Israeli allies, particularly in the global north, to say, well, how can there be apartheid when you have Palestinian doctors in Israeli hospitals, you have a Palestinian judge in Israeli courts, and so on. Now, I think here two things that are very important. First of all, that an apartheid system, and this is part of the fragmentation, what it does essentially is fragments, that this is one fragment of the Palestinian population. And we cannot separate them to look particularly at those few, the few fragments and say, well, look, here there is more equality than the rest. It doesn't work like this. I'll give you an example about myself. I hold Israeli citizenship. My wife does not. She is from the West Bank. She holds different legal status than I am. Me and her, in some places, we cannot travel the same roads. If we are to travel outside the country, we cannot, for example, leave through the airport. She's not allowed to do that. I am not allowed to travel through the crossing with Jordan, where she is allowed to travel, for example. Our children we need to choose for our children whether to have her legal status or my legal status, but we can never, as a family, have a common legal status. So you see, although me, as a holder of Israeli citizenship, I enjoy more rights than her, but we're all Palestinians, right? And part of the system is to make this hierarchy, even between those who are colonized and oppressed and victims of apartheid, to also be able to control better. And be able then to also say to the world, well, look, I have a doctor, I have those who have rights, and you cannot say that it is apartheid. So this is one, like that you have to look at the Palestinian people as a whole and how that system treats them as a whole, not to take one fragment and look at it. But even if you take that one fragment, it is very important to understand that within Israel, there is a difference, and in Israeli law, there is a difference between a national and a citizen. So every national is a citizen, but not every citizen is a national. So this, particularly for then democracies, is mind-boggling, because usually the two words should mean the same thing, but they do not. It is only Jews who are national and can enjoy the full rights granted to them by the state. Others are citizens, but they do not enjoy the full spectrum of rights. And I think the most important here to highlight is the right to self-determination. The Palestinians, even within, as a national minority within Israel, can never be recognized as a national minority and can never enjoy the right to self-determination as a national minority. And this is codified in law. In 2018, Israel passed what is called the nation-state law. It is a law that says that only Jews have the right to self-determination in the state of Israel, that basically the state of Israel is only for the Jews, not for anybody else. And that the law also does other things, including, for example, the promotion of Israeli settlements, including in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as demoting the Arabic language, which was an official language in the state of Israel until 2018. So I think it's these two things that are very important when addressing this question. One, that Palestinian people are one, and any attempt of fragmenting them, saying no, they are different. Those who are living under Israel are different from refugees outside, are different from those in Gaza, are actually playing into then the system and the discourse of apartheid, of Israeli apartheid. So that is one. Two, you only need to look at Israeli laws, particularly those laws that make a difference between nationals who are only Jews and citizens who can be others, including Palestinians, and see how then Palestinians always remain at the second or a third class when it comes to the full enjoyment of rights. And here is when you see apartheid in its purest form.
Thank you, Saleh, for that explanation again. I think we have to read the report more to really see the whole picture again. Another question which I want to ask you is, after the publication of this report by Amnesty International, by right, this should be adopted by countries in their policy making. But the problem is some countries have rejected, right, the report. Can you explain a bit more which countries actually rejected the report, and what are the bases, and whether their arguments for rejecting the report holds water or not? Please, thank you.
Thank you. So following the publication of the report, I myself and my colleagues, when I was at Amnesty, have done quite a lot of advocacy engagement with governments, both in the global north and in the global south. And there's been, let me start with then some of the positives, if you allow me, Professor, is that there was a very positive response and engagement by both civil society and also state authorities in the global south. Malaysia, I think, is one of the best examples here. South Africa is another, Namibia, governments in Latin America. So Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Because of then the history, the understanding of what it means to live in a colonizing situation, in a systematic discrimination, and so on. In the global north is a different story, of course, and here is where you have the double standards and the hypocrisy of then the global north come very clear. But there was no one instance where a government or officials from a government, whether in Europe or North America, that have engaged either Amnesty or other organizations, and now still in my role now, I do try and engage governments. There was no one instance where anybody has brought any substantial arguments against the report. No one has picked something and said, well, look, we have here, there is a question about, for example, facts, or a question about legal analysis, or there was none of this. Until now, there is none of this. What we have heard is rejection, complete, and there's a spectrum, complete rejection, Canada and the United States, semi-complete rejection, like, for example, countries like the UK, France, and others, Germany, and there is where an argument came to say that we need a judicial body to come and rule whether the situation amounts to apartheid or not, which you would feel that, there is validity on that. You say, all right, a human rights organization have done a report, but, this is a crime against humanity, and we need then a court to look into this. Now, where the hypocrisy and double standards come, that you have a court that can look into this and has jurisdiction actually over this, and it defines a crime against humanity of apartheid. This is the International Criminal Court. and it has an open investigation into the situation of Palestine. And countries like Germany and the UK and others who are members and very big supporters of the International Criminal Court when it comes to, for example, China, Russia, and others. Most recently, we've seen an arrest warrant issued against Russian President Putin for then the aggression on Ukraine, but we haven't seen 1 inch of move by the International Criminal Court on the situation in Palestine, right? And part of this is, yes, it may be the office of the prosecutor of the ICC, but also because of the pressure that is from countries such as Germany, that has made the case that the ICC, for example, does not have jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territories. That basically what he was saying, although it is a major supporter of the court, that it doesn't want the court, it wants the court to work everywhere, but it doesn't want the court to work in Israel or on Israel. So the answer here to the question, to this then argument that we need a judicial body to look into this, we say, well, look, there is a judicial body that can look into this if you give it the support and the political and other support to be able to do that. So now there are other countries or officials, let's say, who in private setting would say, fully agree, the report is excellent, both Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others. The case is very strong, but we cannot say anything about this in public. Our policy is not there. We're not going to change it now. And they go back to, and thank you very much for opening, Professor Nazari, about the two-state solution. They go back to say we need and keep prioritizing a political process, long dead, before we engage with these issues. And there is here by both Palestinians and human rights organizations is that this is not only incorrect, but it's also harmful to put international law and human rights as second to then political negotiations that does not exist. International law and human rights must take precedent here. It must be centered, and that is then the response.
We are losing your voice, Saleh. For some reason, the connection is not so good. I hope we're going to get you back soon. Saleh, can you hear me? Uh-oh. For some reason, we are not able to get Saleh.
Hello?
Yeah.
I'm back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay.
Just now, we lost you for about 10 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay. No, so, glad it's everything's fine.
Can you go back to the two-state solution thingy, and then why it's like a cup? They keep talking about it as a pretense. I suppose they don't want to talk about the report, but they keep going back to that. Yeah.
So yes, it's they go back to a state solution, which has right from the beginning been a tactic and a strategy that reinforces the fragmentation that is imposed by settler colonialism, that it partitions a land that should have never been partitioned, and it partitions a people that should never be partitioned as well. And I think what is very important, I mean, you can look at, for example, the depth of the negotiations, that there is none, that there is no prospects of this, expired paradigm. But I think the most importantly is to listen to what Palestinians are saying. And in 2021, Palestinians have took to the streets, both inside of 48 and what has become, Israel, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and also in exile, in what has become called Dignity and Unity Intifada. And Intifada is a word for uprising. That has basically been an act, if you want, a popular vote by Palestinians that came out with a very clear voice of who we are, that us as Palestinians, we are one, both in colonized Palestine and in exile, and what we want. What we want is free Palestine from the river to the sea. So it was a referendum that says we are one as a people and we are one as a geography that can never be partitioned. So even if you put all kind of the international relations analysis on the side of, how much really there is a possibility or not possibility of a negotiation, two states, blah blah, all that, and the politicians even in those countries who are strong allies of Israel recognize both publicly and privately that there is no more hope for a two-state solution. I mean, Israel has just completely destroyed it by the further colonization and separation, fragmentation, by basically making apartheid even more deeply rooted than it is ever before, that you have no possibility of that. But I think what is equally important, or perhaps more important, is then that voice of Palestinians who, lacking any venue of political and civil participation, that took to the streets, and their voice was very clear from Haifa all the way through Jerusalem down to the Naqab Desert. The voice clear: we are one as people, we are one as geography, and that's what that is the only basically reality we will accept.
Okay, thank you, Saleh. Last question. To the audience who are listening to the talk, to your talk now, to explanation about the Amnesty International report, we hear your explanation that the world is basically still ignoring, and only few countries are taking it up, but many other countries are silent. Some are willfully rejecting, intentionally rejecting the truth. So, what should people in the audience there? What should they do in order to make it? Your report has been or the Amnesty International report is very detailed, a lot of work, a lot of man hours involved. So make it worthwhile. How do we help to make it really impactful and worth the effort that you put into that? What should we do as people out here listening to you? I don't know whether Saleh, we are losing you again. I hope you can hear me. You could hear me just now. Uh, let's wait a few seconds for the connection to come back. For us to be connected again. We have some connection problem again with Saleh. Okay.
Hello.
Yes. Did you hear my question just now, Saleh?
Oh. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but your okay. Now you are back online again. Okay, go ahead. So did you hear my question just now? What should people? Yeah. Go ahead.
So most recently, we've seen another historic call. I and other Palestinians believe that has come out from a large coalition, including the BDS movement, Palestinian human rights organizations, the largest NGO network in Palestine, along with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that is calling for the creation of a global front to dismantle Israel's settler colonialism and apartheid. And in that call, there is a clear definition of what we as Palestinians mean when we say apartheid, contextualizing it within Zionist settler colonialism, identifying Zionist ideology, racist ideology as core to that. But it also spells out what should happen, including by making a call again for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And I think this remains the most effective and ethical thing that people around the world can do, is ensure that there is no complicity in Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, and to ensure that there is further isolation of an apartheid regime until basically it is removed from Palestine and from anywhere around the world. Because what is clear is that we cannot accept apartheid in our world today, not in Palestine, not anywhere else. And this is a moral and ethical obligation, right, of everyone. And people can take action both on their local level, where there is, for example, uh, uh, relations with Israel. For example, I'm here in Mozambique, and I'm here because of the Israel Apartheid Week. And for the first time, we have three organizations, including, for example, a transport company, a Samora Machel Documentation Center, and an NGO called Justiça Ambiente, who've declared themselves an apartheid-free zones, which means that they will ensure that their space, in their relations, in whatever they do, that they will never have a relation with apartheid Israel, that they will ensure that they will not be part of this complicity. And I think this can apply, of course, everywhere around the world. So what can be done is for us to come together, very similar to what happened in then when there was apartheid in Southern Africa, for people to come together, to impose a boycott, to isolate the apartheid regime until its eventual dismantlement, including by the imposition of sanctions. Right, sanctions are very important. So, and this go back to the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. We need to spread boycott more. We need to ensure there is more and more divestment. And ultimately, and I think very importantly, and we are right now at this stage, we need to have an imposition of sanctions by both states and the UN against the Zionist state.
Okay, thank you very much, Saleh, for those words. We have already reached 1 hour, more than 1 hour now, so I have to let you go now. But that call for more support for the BDS movement is, of course, very relevant, because I'm also the chairman of BDS Malaysia. We are calling on Malaysians to support our efforts, and we in Malaysia put the higher barrier. In other words, we call for no normalization, no diplomatic relations, no imports, no business, no trade, political or sporting. No Israeli athletes are supposed to come to Malaysia to participate in any sporting event. I hope the Malaysian government will continue with that policy, and we hope that the Malaysians will be behind us to make sure that the policy of normalization, total boycott will continue in the future. So thank you again, Saleh.
And, thank you. And Ramadan Kareem in advance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Ramadan Kareem to you too. Bye-bye. Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Bye-bye.